Hello, everyone. We're going to be starting in just a minute. I'm just trying to, oops, sorry, adjust the camera here before we get started. And I think I've just dropped half my Post-it notes right down on the floor. I'm really good at collecting those. So if you are joining us for the first time live, I want to go over just a little bit of info before we get started. So a little orientation. Down here at the bottom, if you are on a smart device, if you run your finger along it, you will see that there's a row of different options there. You can, the main one you want to focus on is the chat roll. So the chat roll is what looks like the idea bubble with 3 dots in the middle. Click on that and the chat will pop up. If you have a question or a comment that you want to make, type it in there where it says type message here, then hit enter or return so it throws it up into the chat roll where all the rest of us can see it. And one thing I want to make sure of is please feel free to pop a comment or a question in there at any point. So we're going to be talking this evening about one of the topics that I am super passionate about, and that's studio safety. And many thanks to Mavis, who suggested the topic, even inadvertently, but she said that it would be really nice to have all the things that I've said about studio safety and solvent-free painting in one place. And I realized I had never put it all into one thing before. So time to do that. And there are a couple of different reasons that I feel as strongly about it as I do. And it goes back to 2 kind of separate things. When I was a graduate student, 2 of my mentors in undergraduate and graduate school, actually a little after graduate school, both became ill from the effects of working with materials that they'd been working with for years in the studio. Granted, both of them were using them in ways that we now understand, and even understood to a degree at the time, were not good. But they were casual about the way they used their art materials. And as a result, they both died much younger than they should have. And that definitely impacted how I looked at art materials and how I wanted to teach how to use art materials. The other thing that had a big impact happened early on in my teaching career when one of my students was taking painting and found out she was pregnant very early in the course. And as a result, I wanted to make the painting studio as safe as possible for her because she wasn't going to drop painting. So that meant I needed to get solvents out and minimize her contact with harmful stuff. So over the years, that's been one of my main research areas. So I'm going to try not to go too academic on you. But if I start to go down that route, raise your hand. In other words, just holler at me in the chat roll, and I will try to come back to reality a little bit. But it is a rabbit hole that I do tend to go down. So I want to talk about it, studio safety, in some big categories, so that we move from kind of general to real specific. And there's some big things that painters in particular need to pay close attention to. And then there's some just general things that we need to talk about. So, hey, Christine, it's good to have you here. So just some general things that people don't often think about when they're working with art materials, particularly painters don't often think about it. We're working with chemicals. And yeah, most of them are natural chemicals, not all of them, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they're chemicals. And we want to make sure that we're working with as many non-toxic chemicals or working as safely as possible with those chemicals while we're working. So a few chemical basics. Read the labels. Almost everything, especially here in the US, and I believe in the EU and Canada as well, it is law that the materials have to be labeled on there. So if it's toxic, it has to say it on there. Now, how we define toxic can be radically different. So there's no one official way to decide what's toxic and not. The FDA can come out with certain standards. art materials associations can come out with certain standards, and the individual companies themselves can have standards. So there can be a little bit of confusion around whether or not it means completely, absolutely non-carcinogenic and safe when it says non-toxic, or it means safe to use when handled with care. I would assume, just as a regular across-the-board assumption, that when you see non-toxic, it means when handled with normal usage. Because remember, even water is toxic in too great an amount, although today I haven't had enough. So you want to be careful with even things that are labeled non-toxic, just to be on the safe side. So understand what you're working with and know what the hazards are with the materials that you use on a regular basis. When you're using, if you insist on using things like thinners and solvents, make sure you keep them in containers that are not normally drink containers. You would be shocked at how many painters I know will stick solvent in old coffee cups. That's a horrible habit, because there's always that moment when you're absorbed in your painting and you reach out for a sip of that coffee and you grab the solvent cup. Not a good thing. So use non-food containing containers to hold your art materials so you don't run that risk of accidentally consuming them in the wrong way. Cover them when you're not using them. You should never leave solvents out without a cover on them. They evaporate into the air, and solvents hang low to the floor. And when they hang low to the floor, they gather and they don't dissipate. And you don't necessarily know how much is down there. That's one of the reasons I don't like odorless thinners or solvents without odors, because you won't know how much is in the room. If you're insisting on using solvents, which I strongly recommend you do not do, then use turpentine with good ventilation so that you know how much is present in the room. If there's too much turpentine, you're going to smell it and you'll know it's time to leave. The danger of those odorless thinners, even Gamsol, you don't realize how much has gone airborne over the time that you're working because you can't smell it. So there's way more of it in the air than you realize. So be careful with it and do not leave it uncovered. Label all of those containers that you put stuff into so you know what's in that container, so that you can dispose of it carefully when you're done with it. So I don't recommend using solvents. I'm going to talk in just a few minutes about what I do instead to paint with oils in a solvent-free studio. You do not have to switch to water-soluble oils in order to be safe. So the first part of painting that you need to be concerned about and you need to think about in terms of safety is the most basic part of painting, and that's pigments. Pigments are the coloring agents in paint. So when you look at the different mediums, they all have pigments in there. And they usually have the same pigments across mediums. You have watercolor, acrylics, oils, casins, gouache, all of those different mediums, pastels, that are all using the same pigments. What's different from medium to medium is the vehicle or the binder. That's the thing that holds it together. So in oil, the vehicle or the binder is linseed oil usually, sometimes safflower or poppy seed. In acrylics, it is, take a guess, acrylic. In watercolor, the binder is gum arabic. So it just depends. That binder can bring in a different set of chemical reactions, but of all of those, the safest, absolutely the safest, is actually oils, because the binder in oils is completely vegetable, it's natural, and doesn't inherently of itself contain the carcinogenic materials. Now, the different pigments can have some carcinogens in there, but the medium is not carcinogenic and it's non-toxic. Linseed oil is non-toxic. So the most toxic is, and it might be a surprise, pastel. So the reason that pastels are the most toxic of the painting mediums is that when you're working with pastels, all of the pigment dust, and you're using very little other binder in a pastel. It's almost pure pigment. All of that pigment dust goes into the air. So when you're drawing, it releases dust into the air, and it's usually right close to your nose. So if you are a pastelist, you better be wearing a dust mask. I used to do pastels all the time. I did big pastels when I was in graduate school, 4 by 6 feet. And I was not wearing a dust mask to begin with because I was a silly fool. And I got respiratory infections. And it wasn't until, it's going to sound gross, but it wasn't until I blew my nose and it was blue that I realized I really needed to wear a dust mask. And when I started, I had just that little disposable dust mask. And I took it off at the end of the day, and it was multicolored and gross. And that freaked me out. So I went to Lowe's and got the Darth Vader big respirator. And I had to change those filters at least once a week because of how much pastel dust goes in there. I'll talk about oil pastels in just a second, Christine. They're a little different than regular pastels. So regular pastels go airborne really, really easily, way more than you think they do. So if you're going to use regular pastels, please get a ventilation system in your studio that's going to pull the dust away from you and away from your face. Wear a respirator, not just the dust mask, but a respirator. And yeah, you'll look goofy, but you get over it. You get used to wearing it if you really want to use that material. Otherwise, dust mask and outside. Because the other problem with pastels, if you're going to use them inside, especially if you have a home studio, that pastel dust, if you're not using some sort of ventilation unit, that pastel dust goes into your air vents and then circulates through your house. So everybody else in the house is also breathing in pastel dust. So you have to be super careful with them. So the least dangerous actually is oils, and the most dangerous is pastel. And the reason is that the pigment is carried straight into your system with pastels. Now, it's possible to use non-toxic pigments with pastel and to reduce your exposure that way, but you're still breathing dust into your lungs unless you wear a respirator. So when you're thinking about the pigments themselves, the ones that you want to eliminate from your studio are the heavy metals, things like lead white, Naples yellow, if it's true Naples yellow. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Cobalt, cadmium, any of the heavy metals need to go out. Now, don't throw them away. Use them up. I'm not quite that much of an extremist. Use them up, but just don't buy them anymore. Now, if you've got real Naples yellow, you need to turn that into hazardous waste. I really kind of think you need to turn flake white in too. But any of the others I would think you could use up. But cobalts, cadmiums, flake white, lead white, Pigments white, all of those are lead-based. Naples yellow is a lead-based. Any of those that are actual real pure pigments that are of a hue name like that are heavy metals, you don't want to be using those because heavy metals are absorbed into your system and they build up over time. They are known carcinogens. And yes, you can have problems from those. You want to minimize your exposure to those and minimize the exposure of your family and your pets. If you're using pastels and you're using those heavy metal colors, you are committing double jeopardy and playing Russian roulette with your health. Please don't do that. So let me talk for a second there about the difference between pigments, pure pigments, and hues, because this is where it can get a little confusing when you're trying to get rid of those heavy metals. So most of us are aware that there's a difference between cadmium and cadmium hue. Cadmium is a pure heavy metal. Cadmium hue is usually something like naphthol red. So it's a non-toxic variant. It's a hue. It's the same color, it's the same hue, but it's a different pigment source. So if you see a color name that's a heavy metal color name with hue after it, you're safe. You're good. You're golden. You've gotten hold of a non-toxic substance and you're fine. But you want to avoid the pure heavy metal ones right away. Just get those out as fast as you can. Any cadmiums, any chromes, any zinc yellow, all of those are carcinogens, and you need to not be using them. They can cause problems in skin contact. They can be absorbed through open cuts in your skin, and they can cause nerve damage long term. So they really are quite nasty, and you really, really do want to eliminate them. If you are careful about eliminating those heavy metals, careful about removing those real toxic pigments, then you can end up with a fairly safe studio, because the other pigments are fairly non-toxic. So yeah, Christine, I agree. I always think about how gambling gets toric gray. They get it from their filters, and it's from their ventilation filters, not from their masks, but their ventilation filters. It's the pigment that gets caught in there and then gets mixed up. And you don't want to be breathing that kind of stuff in. They make, each manufacturer is required to create something called an MSDS sheet. So if you really want to dig deep into toxicity levels on those other pigments beside the heavy metals, and really reduce your exposure to anything that's potentially carcinogenic down the road, you can look at the MSDS sheets for the paints that you normally use and find alternatives that might be safer if there's something that's a concern for you. So you're usually good as long as you remove those heavy metals. But if you have any particular extra safety concerns, then you need to balance that out and look at the MSDS sheets and see if you can remove those out. There are palettes that you can create using earth tones, ones that are non-toxic, using earth tones that can create a full range of colors without venturing into some of the synthetics that people are concerned about. I don't really think most of the synthetic colors are problematic, but those particular natural earth colors are even less likely to be toxic than some of the others. But the main ones I want you to worry about now, heavy metals. Get those out. When you're looking at paints and their toxicity, in addition to the pigments, you want to look at the mediums. And there are two basic groups there that I want to talk about. One is water-based paints. You know, there's that myth out there that oils are more toxic than acrylics. The oils are more toxic than watercolor. Hopefully I've dissipated that now, and you realize that as long as you get rid of solvents, oils are really safe to use. But when you're looking at water-based paints, there's still some things you should consider there as well, especially if you're using acrylics and you're sensitive to certain chemicals. So acrylics use a small amount of formaldehyde in there to prevent the growth of mold. If you're sensitive to formaldehyde, I happen to be one of those people, then you want to minimize your air exposure to it. So usually a good ventilation system is enough to reduce your exposure and you'll be fine. It doesn't really do too much to me other than give me a headache. So I'm not that sensitive to it, but some people are more sensitive to it than that. I can smell it. I can tell when it's in the room. So there's the formaldehyde in there. They also include some detergents or ammonia. And again, that's a sudsing agent, and it's to help prevent the growth of mold and to keep the paint mixing correctly. So that's why sometimes you'll see bubbles on the acrylic, and it's the ammonia, the sudsing agent, that's been added to it. So if you're sensitive to ammonia or sensitive to formaldehyde, watch those. It's usually not a problem for people, but if you're already sensitive, you can react to that. There are a few other considerations with water-based paints, mainly due to the vehicle, like casein can have some things in it that you want to look at and think about. And even egg tempera because of the egg that's in there. Both of those can use some things to act as preservatives that can be a little bit harmful to people who are sensitive. But in general, it's related to ammonia, and you don't have any problems as long as you're not going to be reactive to one of those two things. Water-based paints are very different from non-water-based paints. So the water-based paints were things like watercolor, acrylic, gouache, tempera, and casein. They're things that use water for cleaning up. Now, oil paint is a non-water-based paint. Even if it's water-soluble, it's still non-water-based. So oil paint, encaustic, and egg tempera are very different. So does everybody understand the difference between tempera and egg tempera? Tempera paint is like what you use when you're in kindergarten. It's that big jar of opaque, cheap paint that children use. Pretty non-toxic stuff most of the time. Egg tempera has egg as the medium and as the base. So it's a non-water-based paint. So Andrew Wyeth worked in egg tempera, a non-water-based paint. So we've got oil paints, encaustics, and egg tempera that use linseed oil, wax, and egg. Some people have allergic reactions to linseed oil. Again, that's unusual. And you'll know if you're allergic to linseed, if you're allergic to flax, because linseed comes from flax, same root as linen. And you have to be aware of that. The big thing to worry about with oil paints is the use of solvents. Eliminate those, you eliminate most of the health hazards, especially if you're being very, very aware of the pigments that you're using. If you insist, again, on using solvents, use good ventilation and use a type that is going to let you know when you've used too much. There are some substitutes that are out there that are phenomenal. So if you just have to have a solvent, you can't give it up, then I would suggest oil of spike lavender, which is a non-toxic solvent. So oil of spike lavender is based on literally the spikes of lavender blossoms. It's a very, very old solvent, been around for hundreds of years. It is not the chemical solvent like the solvents like odorless thinner. It doesn't have the same volatility. It doesn't have the same toxicity. So you can use oil of spike lavender to do the same things as thinner without having the consequences. So if you really still need those effects, get some oil of spike lavender. Chelsea Studios produces a whole line of those that are wonderful. And they have lavender cleaner, they have oil of spike lavender soap, as well as the solvent. Again, safe to use and non-toxic. If you are worried about cleaning up without the use of solvents, really simple solution. You get a silicoil jar or just a big jar in general. You need 2 of them. I like 3 in the studio. So I fill them with walnut oil because walnut oil has a very, very high threshold. It has to be heated up a whole lot before it catches on fire. It's extremely stable. So if you leave the lid off, you're okay. It's not going to blow up. Linseed oil, on the other hand, is a little bit more volatile. So I fill it with walnut oil. And when that jar gets nasty and it's got too much pigment sitting down in the bottom of it for me to use it anymore, I sit it to the side and let that pigment settle down in the bottom. The silicoil jar has a big coil of metal in the middle of it. Looks like a spring. And when you move the brush back and forth across that, it pulls the pigment out. And it's the first step to cleaning the brush. So I clean it on that and wipe on paper towels and then wash the brush with ivory soap and rinse and lather until the soap is white. The soap suds are white. You may not get all of the stain color out of a brush. So if you look at this brush, I think you can see there's some phthalo blue stains in there somewhere. You're not ever going to get all of those dye colors out, but the paint is out. The binder is out. The oil won't hurt the brush. So it's not going to break down the fibers of the brush. It's kinder to the brush. So when that oil is full of pigment, I'm going to let it settle down. So I put it to the side and I go to my second jar. And I'll use that clean second jar to clean the brushes in. And that other jar is over there settling down. It'll take about a week for it to settle to the bottom. Then I have a third empty jar. And I pour off the oil into that third empty jar. And then I take the pigment sludge that's on the bottom. And if you've used artist grade oil, you can then paint with it. If you want to, it's your own Tauric gray. If you've used food grade walnut oil, don't paint with it. Take it to the hazardous waste disposal. So you can make your own Tauric from that sludge that's in the bottom. Don't throw it in the toilet and don't dump it down the drain. It'll clog the drain. But you can recycle it, either by painting with it or by taking it to hazardous waste. So just clean with oil and then soap and water. Yeah, Christine says, can you take the coil out to clean the jar? You sure can, unless you accidentally leave the lid off and let it dry, but yeah, you can. So I take the coil out, I pour off the sludge into an empty jar with a lid and take that to the hazardous waste, and then wipe out the inside of the jar with paper towels and wipe off. I don't wash it with soap and water. There's no need to, because you're going to pour more paint into it very shortly, or clean off more paint into it. But wipe it off with paper towels, put it back in, and put fresh oil in. Roseanne says, will any soap be okay? I'm sensitive to ivory soap. What about Murphy's? Yeah, Murphy's soap is fine. So yeah, if you're sensitive to ivory and go straight to Murphy oil, it'll work just fine. The only thing I want you to watch for with Murphy oil is that you really rinse adequately so that you're not getting Murphy oil into your painting later. But if you've rinsed those brushes really well, you should be fine. Murphy oil is exactly what is in all of those special brush cleaners. It's the same soap. So you can get a big jar of Murphy oil for a few dollars at the grocery store, or you can spend $10 for a tiny little bar of brush cleaner. They're exactly the same product, packaged in a little bit different way. Yeah, if it doesn't rinse, you don't rinse it well, the brush will stay sticky. But the Murphy oil soap will also remove any dried paint. So if you've left a brush too long and it's dried out, put it in a jar with about half water, half Murphy oil, and let it sit in there overnight, maybe 2 days, and you'll be able to get out anything, whether it's dried acrylic or dried oil. When I taught at the college, I would make a pass through the studio at the end of every semester and collect all the dried out brushes that the girls had left behind, and then clean them, recycle them by cleaning them out with Murphy oil and passing those out to students that either forgot their supplies or just couldn't afford to go buy supplies. So it's entirely possible to totally recondition a brush using Murphy oil soap. It's fantastic. I love that stuff. So clean soap and water and oil. You don't need solvents. And here's another benefit from that. The brushes stay good longer. This brush is over 20 years old, at least. So, and it's still one of my favorite brushes, and I'm hard on brushes. So when you use oil instead of solvent, oil and soap to clean, your brushes will last longer. So if any of y'all are big lovers of synthetic brushes of any sort, you need to stop cleaning them with solvents right now, even if you continue using solvents in your painting. Because with a synthetic brush, the solvent breaks down the fiber of the brush. The fibers are petroleum-based products. They're synthetic. and the solvent breaks them down. That's why sometimes on a synthetic brush, you'll see a splay at the end of a fiber, and it's from the solvent. And it'll happen super fast. It can happen in 3 weeks. In fact, that has happened so often to Rosemary's brushes that I think they may even have a disclaimer on their website at this point, because they're tired of trying to explain to people, don't use solvents on synthetic brushes. So be very, very, very careful with those synthetic brushes, because they're going to fall apart if you use solvents to clean them. Use the safe oil and soap method and you won't have any problems with them. They'll last a really long time. So with non-water-based paints, you just need to be aware that you don't want to use any solvents. Encaustics are enormously problematic. So the two painters, mentors that I mentioned that passed away too young. The first was an acrylic painter, and he had a horrible habit of sticking his brush in his mouth, both the end when he was thinking, the side as he was working, because he picked too many things up at once. And I have to admit, I used to do that too. Stick it in your mouth. And he would stick the tip of his brush in his mouth to bring it to a point before he'd dip it down into the paint to make a dot. And then he'd wipe it, stick it in his mouth to get a point, and then stick it back in the paint. And he ingested an enormous amount of paint doing that, because he was literally putting his paintbrush in his mouth for decades. Don't do that. He had cancer and died way too young because of the combination of smoking, and even though he did quit, but of smoking all that time and of ingesting the paint. The two things don't mix well. They don't give you a good outcome. The other mentor who passed away too young was a pioneer in encaustics. This is one of the reasons I won't touch encaustics. And I'm really leery of cold wax for the same reason. He pioneered encaustics, worked in a studio that was not adequately ventilated. And I don't know how much y'all know about encaustics, but part of the process is heating up the paint in order to paint with it, and then fusing the painting itself afterwards, which means you're applying heat to paint that has wax and solvent in it. So they put solvent in both cold wax and in encaustic paint. And when it's heated up, that solvent goes airborne and is even more toxic. And on top of it, when you heat up things that are already toxic, they give off fumes that your body processes in a whole different way that is still not so cool. Cold wax eliminates some of those problems, but you still have solvent in there. So I don't use cold wax because of that. It's got too much solvent in it. And if you're using encaustics, the only remotely safe way to paint with encaustics is to paint outside. And I'm adding the word remotely safe to that, because I don't think they're safe to use, period. The whole process is fraught with lots of toxicity, and I won't go near them. So be very, very careful. If you love encaustics, you need to get an extremely powerful ventilation system going, because too much stuff goes into the air, and you need to be wearing a respirator that filters out fumes. It needs to be a very, very high quality respirator, because there is so much nasty stuff that you're breathing in otherwise. Plus, if you're doing it in a space that's shared with anybody else, everybody else in that space is breathing it in too. So that's something I want everybody to keep in mind. If you're using solvents in your home, everybody in the house is exposed to it. So be very careful with that, which is another reason why, even if you don't believe that paint is altered by putting in the freezer, and it is, you should never put paint of any sort in your refrigerator or your freezer, because you're putting it in with where your food is stored, and that's not a safe thing to do. So treat your entire family's safety with a lot of extreme caution. Err on the side of caution. So no encaustics, please. Or if you do use them, work in a shed outside where you're not breathing in all of those fumes. There are an awful lot of really nasty things that happen from inhaling solvents over a long period of time. It leads to chronic respiratory failure. So be super careful with that. There's another kind of paint that not that many people use, but I know a handful of people who do, and that's epoxy. Now, epoxy, that's what tends to go on cars, things like that. Epoxy paint have epoxy resin as a component, and it contains the pigment and a hardener. And you mix two things together, and it causes the paint to form and then harden. There are some things that can be put into epoxy paints that are known carcinogens. So be careful with those. And if you're going to use epoxies, read on the labels. Read the MSDS sheets so that you really are being careful about how you're using them. The other thing about encaustics to realize is that wax itself has other things in there, and if it is, depending on the kind of wax that's been used, it releases fumes into the air as well. So again, exercise caution, use good ventilation, and be super careful. Third type of paint I want to talk about is stuff that is propelled through air, like airbrush and spray paint and spray guns. There are two main problems, not problems. There are two hazards that you need to think about with airborne paints. Air-propelled paints might be a better term. Is number one, again, pigments. You want to reduce the heavy metals, because if it's airborne, you're going to be more likely to breathe it in. Second thing is that if it's airborne, you're more likely to breathe it in. And even if it's a non-toxic pigment, it can still cause respiratory problems. So if you're going to use an air-propelled paint, you need to wear a respirator. You need to have adequate ventilation so that you're not breathing it in and not putting your lungs at risk long-term. So be super, super careful with that. Dry drawing media can also have some things to think about as well. You know, we talk about pencils as having a lead. They really don't have lead. They're made out of graphite. So they're not really a big problem. And most of the things that used to be a problem about pencils are no longer a problem. They're relatively safe. Thing to think about with charcoal or colored chalks or pastels, the dry pastels, is again that airborne dust particulate, and making sure that you don't have pigments in there that are heavy metals. Charcoal, even something as benign as charcoal, too much charcoal breathed in is not a good thing either. Oil pastels and crayons do not present the same sort of inhalation problem. So going back to the question you asked, Chris, earlier about oil pastels, they don't go airborne like dry pastels do. And so they don't have the same health hazards. Really, the only thing you need to watch for in either crayons, the waxy crayons, and they do make crayons. I love old Crayolas, but they also make crayons out of more archival material, but they're still wax-based. Neither one of those produces airborne material. You just need to watch out for the pigments that are actually used. So those are the main things to think about and be careful about with paints. I'm not going to dive into too much with markers or felt pens, but that covers the main conglomeration there. And I don't want to drone on too long. I want to make sure I leave some time for questions, because I can go on forever on those issues, because I really do feel strongly about it. Make your studio as safe as possible so it's a pleasant place to work. And if your studio is in your home, You need to work twice as hard to make sure that you're keeping it safe so that you're keeping everybody else who's in your home safe as well. Children, pets, people who might have challenged respiratory systems. You just want to remember what you're breathing in, everybody else is going to be breathing in as well. And animals can be even more particularly sensitive to some of those things than humans. For example, what is really benign for us, the lavender spike oil, it's great for us, not so much for dogs and cats, especially cats. Cats are hypersensitive to the volatiles that are in lavender oil. And you don't want to use oil of spike lavender if you've got cats in the house, because you can run into problems with that. Bottom line is you're using chemicals and you need to know what they are and how they're going to interact. So, any questions? Y'all have been great. So I know we have a good crew here tonight. So let me check in with any other questions that might have come in and give y'all a chance to propose some questions too. I know I haven't covered everything you have a question about. Chris says, no solvents for me. Yay, Christine. I think that's a good attitude to take. I actually bought some Gamsol last year this time because I was painting outside and we had a cold snap and it got so cold that I couldn't move my paint with the palette knife. And so I bought some Gamsol so that I could make the paint move on the mornings where it was close to freezing out. And I was painting outside. That's the last time I bought any solvent. So you can get by without it. And I think that image of how Gamblin makes Torrid Gray needs to stay in everybody's mind. It comes out of the ventilation filters, the vent filters. So Roseanne says, Gamblin seems to really be the only company that makes less toxic paints. Any other suggestions? I think they are the most vocal about it, Roseanne, and they are the most consciously vocal. They're extraordinarily consciously vocal, but they're not the only one. The reality is that the other paint companies are using the same pigments. Gamblin is more, I don't know what the right word is. They are more assiduous about that they stamp things non-toxic, when in reality, the other companies are using the same things, but they're not labeling it as such. So, you know, everything, including water, has some toxicity depending on the amount of it that you use. But you're going to find the exact same paints in Williamsburg and Vasari and Blue Ridge and all of those others. The same pigments. They might not have labeled it non-toxic, but it's just as non-toxic. So what you want to watch for is you want to look at the paint. And for example, Roseanne says, I see Utrecht now makes cadmium-free paints in a few shades. That is a marketing ploy. They have always made cadmium-free paints. They used what was called cadmium hue, and that was naphthol red. So all they have done is relabeled their cadmium hue cadmium-free, and they're now charging more. So keep in mind that you need to know what's actually in there. If it says hue, you're fine. It's non-toxic. If it says cadmium and without the hue on there, then you're in trouble. But no, Utrecht just figured that people are sensitive to the heavy metals now, and so they're labeling the reds that are cadmium-free, and charging you more for them. Whereas before, they had to charge you less because it was not as pure a pigment, not as pure and not as expensive a pigment. So hue is just as intense. It's a substitute. So for example, let me pull some up here. And we'll look at Williamsburg since that's what I recommend all the time. I use Gamblin and Williamsburg for the most part. And I want to show you, Chris, on the intensity there are substitutes out there for the hues. A lot of times the hues are student grade paints, but not always at all. So I'm going to get the Williamsburg site to come up, and then I'll share the screen. And it's going to be slow to load. Yeah, there's a chart that gives you comparable colors. And remember what I said about non-toxic being a sliding range. It is not a definitive term because there is no official governmental term that determines what non-toxic paint is, what levels of stuff is in there that's going to make it non-toxic. So it's a self-labeling, and I want y'all to realize you're going to have to start looking to get the least toxic stuff out there. You're pretty much safe. You've pretty much removed the toxic stuff if you get rid of the heavy metals. So don't be fooled by things being labeled non-toxic to think that things that don't have that label aren't, because they're still pretty much non-toxic. So when we look at Gamblin's website and you look at their paint swatches, because if I remember right, their swatches show the actual paint. I think I've got the window too big. It's going to be slow to open. One of the new substitutes, Chris, is a pigment called Purulene Red. And Purulene is a synthetic dye. It's not as opaque as cadmium, but it's actually more intense. So sometimes the substitutes are better. And that's another reason I don't like using the heavy metals, is there's so many other substitutes now that are actually better than those heavy metals that there's no justification to keep on using them. So when you look at the Williamsburg pigments here is Cad Red Medium in the Williamsburg. Let me make this bigger. Oh, and darn it, the Purple Red is not loading. Let's see if I can get it to load. I can get it on a separate page. There it is. So here's the Purple Red. This is Purulene Red, is the pigment. And it's not as opaque. You can see how transparent it is. But this is diluted right here. Look at how rich and thick it is. It is a really, really saturated color. Purulene Red is a lot like phthalo blue. It's that intense. Whereas cadmium is not nearly as strong. Fanchon Red is, all of these have the same hue. They're the same red. Different pigments are making it. So Purulene, the Purple Red, and the Fanchon Red have the same hue as the Cadmium Red Medium, but they're with safer pigments. So either one of those is a great substitute. Doesn't say non-toxic on here, but it's the same pigment as some of those non-toxic labels that you see over there in Gamblin. This is the Fanchon Red, which is a naphthol red pigment, a little different than the Purulene. It's not quite as intense as the Purple Red, but pretty close. So that's what I mean by looking at the actual charts for a substitute. There is a website, and it's let's see if I can remember the address. See if my computer remembers. There it is. Artistcreation.com is a pigment database. So if you want to compare the pigments, so if we go to red, they actually link to the different paint companies so that you can order it if you want to. So you can look at, these are all the old, naturally occurring, historic red pigments. And we won't go to some of those. A number of those are highly toxic. They don't use those anymore. You'd have to go to black market sources to get hold of those. But if we scroll down, I'll do a search for cadmium Red Hue. So when we go to the Cadmium Red Hue, you can see that it's a naphthol red. And the different, not sure which red that is. Let's see which one DR is. Dick Blue, Dale or Rowney. Should have remembered that. But you can see the actual companies. You can look at the different companies that are producing paints that are really similar. So Roseanne, if you want to do the comparison to find others that are similar, you can go here, but there's an easier way to do that. If you look on the tube, the paint tube, and look at the pigment, it will usually list the name like naphthol red. Sometimes it just lists a number like PR9. So if, go back to Williamsburg for a minute. If you're looking at Pure Red, or let's go to Fanchon Red, because I know there are going to be many more of them that are similar. I think, why not? Let me go to the information part here. Each paint manufacturer has the basics listed on a chart. Almost all of them will do that now. So if I search for Fanchon, you can see that it's PR 112. If I go to Gamblin's website, to remember the web address, and they have theirs right on the page. So their naphthol red, it doesn't have a funky name like Fanchon Red does. It's the exact same pigment. It's PR 112. So it is literally the exact same paint. Almost, the formula is only different in how much filler they're using, and they might have a little bit different proportion of pigment to oil. But Roseanne, if you want to check for other alternatives to Gamblin, just look on the tube of paint and you'll see the pigment listed there. And then you can compare that same name in a different brand and shop around that way. But almost all of them have a naphthol red because it's a standard substitute for cadmium red medium. See, and it even says that on here. It's a modern organic warm red that closely matches cadmium red medium. It's just a little bit more transparent and it makes more intense hues. So it's actually richer and more intense than cadmium is. So it's one of my favorites. So you can do a little snooping around, as my daughter calls it, on the different websites if you want to compare and contrast the colors, and you can figure out which ones are comparable. But don't feel like you're locked in just to one brand. I love Gamblin, and I find their devotion to safety and the level of care that they put into their product to be outstanding. But they're not the only ones who are creating non-toxic paint by a long shot. All of them are. You just have to be careful which tube of paint you buy, and you're going to be fine. One thing that Gamblin does that, again, is, well, they do several things that nobody else does, but they have a whole section on studio safety, and I'm going to link to that in the replay link for this, because there's no point in my recreating what they've already done. Their studio safety guide is outstanding. I do have a checklist, studio safety checklist, that we're going to be loading up tomorrow, but I really want y'all to download Gamblin's Studio Safety Guide, their solvent-free painting guide, and looking at their whole studio safety section, because it really shows how devoted they are to their audience. So they want to help keep you safe. And one of the reasons that I became so interested in it is at school, as a painting instructor, we had to have all this data for all of our evaluators and accreditation agencies, because it was a liability for the college for us to use materials that were unsafe. So we had to find the substitutes along the way to get rid of all the dangerous stuff. And Gamblin is one of the only companies that I know of that produces a painting guide for schools so that colleges, universities, and high schools can teach oil painting in a way that is safe for their students. So lots and lots of good information on there, as well as their extraordinary part of their website that is on color theory. That's really good too. Highly, highly recommend taking a walk over there. Christine says, while painting with brushes, what do you use to clean a brush to use it immediately after? If I am, well, what I normally do, Chris, honestly, I buy these by the dozen. And so I'll have 3 out at a time, same size. So I have number 8s and number 12s that I paint with for the most part, and then some long thin ones because I love filberts. And I'll use one for really light colors, one for medium, and one for dark. And in between, if I need to eliminate a color, so I only put the light brush in the light colors, I will wipe it with a paper towel and then go to the next light color, because that tends to, it's the value transfer that becomes a real problem. So I wipe the brush just like I wipe the knife between a stroke. Make a mark, leave it, wipe, make a mark, leave it, wipe. When you wipe like that, you end up not having enough paint still on the brush for it to pollute the next pile. If you're finding your brush still gets messy, then some walnut oil, artist grade walnut oil in a little paint cup or a cat food can works just great. And just use the artist grade oil to clean the brush just like you used to use the solvent. So substitute walnut oil for solvent all across the board and you'll be good to go with that. But wiping with paper towels really is your friend. The thing to also remember, because I didn't go into the fire safety with rags, when you've got a lot of paper towels that you've been using to wipe off with, you need to dispose of those at the end of every day, because the oil, when it's sitting around, is not a good thing. So take it out to the trash at the end of every day. Oh, to condition brushes, guess what? You're doing it when you're cleaning it, if you're cleaning them correctly. So if you're using Murphy oil or you're using walnut oil to clean your brushes, you are conditioning them while you're cleaning. So what I like to tell students is only clean your brushes with stuff that you would put on your hair. And I know none of y'all would put solvent on your hair, so you shouldn't put solvent on your brush, because the solvent's going to destroy the hair of the brush just like it would destroy the hair of your head. And if you think about what goes into old-fashioned historic hair conditioners, it's oil. It's oil, it's oil, it's oil. And so when you put it in the linseed oil to clean it, it reconditions it. So if you have and always follow up with ivory soap, or you don't have to with Murphy oil, you just rinse. If you have a brush that's gotten all splayed out and it's gotten bent and been abused, then take Murphy oil, straight Murphy oil, and work it into the brush like that, and then pull it. So you're pulling while the soap is still in there. Murphy oil soap is still in there. Pull it to pull the brush back into shape and to work it back into shape. Then let the Murphy oil soap dry in the brush overnight, maybe 2 days, and then rinse it all out. And what will happen is you reset the brush. It's just like setting your hair, and you'll get the brush back into shape and back into condition. So Murphy oil to recondition for sure, and then follow up with rinsing and cleaning it out. So really relatively easy to keep brushes in shape when you're not using solvent on them, not to beat a dead horse. Roseanne says, I love walnut oil. If I switch to using walnut oil the way you're suggesting, that would be a lot of oil, a place to purchase larger amounts. It actually isn't, because you're recycling it. So I didn't, I'm trying to think of the last time I bought a bottle of the walnut oil for cleaning. And I think it's been over a year, and I only bought a pint. So it's actually not that much, because remember I said I had 3 silicoil jars? Only 2 of them have walnut oil in them at a time. So that one that got too messy to clean my paint anymore, clean the brush anymore, I let the jar settle, so the pigment drops down to the bottom, and there's a lot of clear oil on the top. It'll be more than, it's usually 3/4 to more pure oil on top after it's settled down. I'll pour that pure oil into the empty jar, and then I'll take the sludge that was in the bottom and dispose of that. But I'm only getting rid of like maybe 1/5 of the oil that was in that jar. And then the clear oil pours into the 3rd jar. Clean out the first one and then let it sit so that when I'm messed up the next one, it can go back into that one. So I've recycled the walnut oil over and over and over. It doesn't go rancid really easily either, but generally I don't have to buy more than a pint of that a year. And I clean my brushes in food grade walnut oil because of the cost. And so that really is not a big expense. I get, like I said, it's the pint size, and you can get it at health food stores. Most grocery stores now carry it as well. The actual brand, if you're here in the States, that I use is Spectrum, and it's a natural food store product, but I found it in the regular grocery store too, and it's maybe $10 a bottle, something like that. So yeah, like Christine said, hers lasted forever. When you keep recycling it and letting the paint settle on the bottom, you'll be shocked how little of it you actually use. The artist grade walnut oil, because I'm only occasionally using that, I, again, don't use very much of it. I love stand oil, and I will use that, and I order that through the art supply store. But yeah, you just don't really go through that much. You will not go through even a quart of that in a year, because you can just keep recycling it. So it actually ends up being a huge cost saver. So what does a big thing of Gamsol cost? At $35 for a gallon or something like that. And you'll go through a ton of that. Whereas if you're using walnut oil to clean, you might need to buy 2 bottles in a year, but I really don't think so. It's way cheaper. So even if you switch to using artist grade so that you could paint with the sludge, you can order bigger quantities of walnut oil from Chelsea Studio, and even some of the other bigger companies are carrying it now too, because there's been a big push from colleges and universities to move to solvent-free studios. So the art manufacturers have had to accommodate by coming up with producing more of the stuff that we need to do that. So everybody benefits in the long term. So yeah, you should be able to find even artist grade from art suppliers. So we've got time for maybe one more question before I let y'all go, because we've now gone to an hour. But if you have any other burning questions that you want to ask about studio safety, speak up, and I'll be happy to come back in and answer other questions that people might have. If there's something I've left off or something people have a question about. Now, I'm not the ultimate authority. It was a research area, but there is always new evidence coming out about new materials and new alternative methods. So I think it bears saying that we all need to stay up on top of that and explore those issues, stay up with the latest information on that, be aware of the impact of what you're using on your health. It is a balance. And, some people weigh the balance and decide they're going to take the risk. They're going to use certain products that are known carcinogens. I think you really have to balance that carefully. It's a personal choice. But if you're doing it in a space that you share with other people, you really need to think twice about that. So be very, very careful. Liquin. Liquin's got some solvent in it. Any of those alkyd resin mediums have a small amount of solvent in there. There's less solvent in there than in regular mediums like, oh, I never use those. I can't even think of the brand names. Windsor Newton's oil painting medium. It's usually a mixture of stand oil and turpentine, and they'll throw a tiny little bit of Damar in there too. So I would be real leery of using Liquin. I used to use it. I don't use it anymore because, again, it has enough solvent in there. I just don't want it in the studio. Most of the paint companies make something like Liquin. Gamblin makes something called Galkyd. And if I use any of them, I'll use Gamblin's. The M. Graham Company makes one with walnut oil. So it's a walnut alkyd medium. Dries a little bit faster. I'm not trying to speed up the drying time of my paintings that much, and that's the only real reason to use something like Liquin or any of the alkyds. Some people like using those as a varnish. They're not a varnish. In fact, they're quite the opposite. They're the total opposite of a varnish. So you should never use one of those as your final layer in a painting. Those are not good things to do. And you want to be really careful with how you finish off a painting. So no, I don't use Liquin at all. So you would just thin the paint with a little walnut oil? Yeah. Actually, I prefer thinning the paint with a little bit of stand oil just because I love the consistency of stand oil. Stand oil is linseed oil that has been thickened by heat. So it's been heated up, so it's thicker, it's gummier, it's more like honey, and doesn't have any solvent in it. And I use that if I'm going to use a little bit of medium. But when I'm teaching, I suggest the walnut oil just for safety reasons because it doesn't catch on fire as easily. So no, I do not recommend alkyd paint at all, not even one little bit, because it's got solvent in it. The paint itself does not. It's using an alkyd resin instead of linseed. But I'm talking about the mediums, Virginia. Any of the alkyd mediums. Liquin is an alkyd resin medium. Galkyd is an alkyd resin medium. And they're using solvent in there. The alkyd paints, I just don't see too many advantages to them because I haven't for decades tried to speed up the drying time of my paints. And you've got to be really careful if you mix alkyd paint with straight oil paint because they have such different drying times that you can end up with cracking. So that's one reason I don't use those. So you got to be super aware of the drying times if you combine those two things together because they really are a different medium. They dry at such different rates. But no, I love stand oil. It's phenomenal. It's like painting with honey. So if you want to do glazing, then I would use stand oil or walnut oil. And it'll do all the things that you want it to do instead of using the Liquin. Just minimize the solvent at all. If you can't give up the solvent for cleaning or mixing, give it up in your medium. So remove it little bit by little bit. You'll be shocked at what a big difference it makes in your breathing when you get it out of the studio because it makes a huge difference. Really, really large. If you have any other questions that come up after we hang up, feel free to pop them, at least for the moment, into the section underneath the event announcement. And we should have the replay up within 24 hours. It can take us a little while to process them. because we do a whole bunch of webinars on Tuesdays, so it takes us a while to get them all up, but it should be up by tomorrow. So I would love to see everybody talking about what they're doing in their studios to make them safer, make them greener, and make them more sustainable. So if people come up with great ideas for things like ventilation and storage and stuff like that, share it. That's part of what the community is all about. Thank y'all for joining me here tonight. It's been great talking with you. And, oh, let me stop sharing so you can actually see me, not in a small little tiny space. So if you have any other questions or issues around safety, let us know and we'll research those up for you. Take care, everybody. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Talk with you again soon. Happy painting, everyone.